Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking on a source stack that, well, it forces us to grapple with history at its most painful and consequential intersection. We're talking about the fusion of political ideology, religious belief, and ultimately the horror of genocide. It's a challenging conversation, but, for anyone who wants to understand the true roots of hatred, it is just absolutely vital.
And our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack the implications of a major new piece of historical research. We're trying to move past the comfortable historical consensus.
Right.
And instead, we're confronting how deep-seated religious traditions can be catastrophically weaponized.
Yeah.
The implications here are urgent. I mean, especially for anyone engaged in contemporary interfaith work.
Our central material is built around Mikael Nilsson's really meticulous 2024 study, Christianity and Hitler's Ideology, and some of the critical analysis that's followed. And Nilsson isn't just suggesting a minor revision here. He is arguing for a truth so uncomfortable that, frankly, many scholars have long resisted confronting it.
And that uncomfortable truth is really the foundation of our entire conversation today. For decades, the prevailing view of Adolf Hitler was that his use of religious language, references to providence, to God, to a Christian mission.
It was all an act.
It was all an act,
Yeah.
purely cynical, just political posturing, a tool to manipulate Christian voters in Germany and, secure power.
So if that traditional view was that Hitler was just an opportunist, a secular nihilist who used religion as a mask, what is Nilsson actually arguing?
He argues that this separation is just fundamentally mistaken. Nilsson contends that Hitler's belief in a version of Jesus and a divine mission. It wasn't just political theater. It was a core foundational pillar of Nazi ideology.
It's a core pillar.
A core pillar, and most critically, a pillar of its genocidal antisemitism, to put it simply. Hitler believed his cause was divinely mandated and rooted in a specific, perverse reading of Christian tradition.
Okay, let's unpack that core thesis, because for so many people, the idea that Hitler was sincerely religious in any meaningful way it's startling. It flies in the face of what we've been taught.
It does.
Which, offered a certain comfort, the comfort of saying Nazism was a godless aberration, completely disconnected from the historical church.
Exactly. That traditional view offered a very clean separation. It sort of absolved the tradition itself. Nilsson's work just challenges that head on, and it's all centered on this concept of the Aryan Jesus.
The Aryan Jesus.
He argues Hitler genuinely believed in this figure, but it was a Christ figure that was explicitly stripped of his Jewish identity and totally recast.
How was he recast? I mean, what did this Aryan Jesus actually look like?
He was reimagined as a divine Aryan warrior, a figure of strength, of purity, of action, engaged in this cosmic metaphysical struggle against Judaism.
So in this view, Judaism wasn't just a different religion.
No, it was the ultimate enemy, the spiritual and racial enemy of the Aryan Christ.
And this wasn't an idea Hitler just cooked up in isolation, was it? It had a history. It had intellectual and theological predecessors.
Oh, absolutely not. This was the dark fruit of the broader Völkisch movement that had been developing in Germany for decades.
And for anyone who hasn't encountered that term, Völkisch.
Think of it as a Babor, a synthesis of extreme, often mystical German nationalism fused with a romantic racial theory. It championed the idea of the German Volk, the ethnic folk, as spiritually and racially unique.
And this movement essentially created the intellectual tools to perform this religious surgery, right? To separate Christ from his origins.
Yes, exactly. Figures like the racial theorist Houston Stewart Chamberlain and Hitler's early mentor Dietrich Eckart, they were foundational here. They provided Hitler with a fully formed racial theological framework.
So they were arguing what? That Christianity's original essence had been corrupted.
They argued it was Germanic and pure, and that this essence had been corrupted by Jewish influence over the centuries. They were giving Hitler the permission structure, the historical proof that his hatred was an act of purification, not destruction.
And here is where the stakes get truly, truly high. The sources suggest Hitler didn't just admire this Aryan Jesus. He viewed himself as the one completing his mission.
That is the truly chilling insight. Hitler didn't see himself as replacing Christ, but as the political and spiritual successor destined to finish the war against the Jews that he believed Christ had started.
Which is why his anti-Semitism was so absolute.
Exactly. It wasn't just a political tactic for him. It was a spiritual mandate.
And you see this play out in specific, almost bizarre historical details, don't you?
We do. There's this anecdote that Hitler sometimes carried a whip as a symbolic gesture. And this wasn't an accident. It was explicitly intended to emulate the story of Jesus driving the money changers from the temple. For Hitler, the whip was a sign of the righteous war-waging Christ, and he saw himself as embodying that active, purifying fury.
This changes everything about how we categorize Nazism. If Hitler and the movement saw themselves as fulfilling a divine mandate, then we can't just dismiss them as secular.
That is the profound implication. If we cling to the idea that Nazism was just secular racial pseudoscience or political nihilism, we miss the driving force. It had deep religious and, frankly, perverse moral underpinnings.
It sounds like that reviewer's summary really hits the nail on the head, that the idea of National Socialism as nihilistic is thoroughly and absolutely mistaken.
Correct. They didn't operate in a moral vacuum. They built a perverse ethical universe. In their view, their genocidal project, the systematic murder of the Jewish people, was not merely justified.
It was morally mandated.
It was morally mandated. It was righteous spiritual work, necessary to fulfill the mission of the Aryan Christ and purify the world.
That reframing is genuinely difficult to process. It means that to prevent it from happening again, we have to understand its moral self-justification, not just its brutality. How far did this appropriation of religious language go? Was it just Christ imagery, or was it broader?
Oh, it was pervasive, constant. He appropriated Christian terminology, imagery, ethical frameworks, everything. He constantly portrayed himself in messianic terms.
I read he even compared his own political awakening to St. Paul's conversion.
He did, to the road to Damascus. He sincerely believed he was divinely guided.
The moment we realize that religious language is entirely malleable and can be used to justify the complete opposite of its stated ideals, that is uncomfortable truth number one, and it has immediate lessons for interfaith work today.
Absolutely. Religious language and symbols are not self-interpreting. They are interpreted by people with power, with prejudice, with political goals. The same texts that inspire profound acts of love could be twisted to mandate violence.
So interfaith dialogue can't just assume that shared values like love or mercy will automatically lead to peace.
No. It demands a level of critical engagement far beyond what's comfortable. It means actively interrogating how a tradition's language has been and is currently being misused.
And this leads right to uncomfortable truth number two, which challenges the very categories we use to define hatred, religious, secular, racial.
Right, because Nilsson's research forces us to see that in Nazi thought, those divisions were just profoundly blurry. He argues race was perceived more as a spiritual than a biological category.
So not just biology.
Not just measurable biology. They saw it as a metaphysical, soul-deep condition. They essentially turned race theory into a kind of theology.
So it's a hybrid ideology where racism and theology just reinforce each other. You can't untangle the racial struggle from the spiritual struggle.
Precisely. And this is so vital because we see this blending everywhere in contemporary prejudice. Think about modern antisemitism, which often fuses theological conspiracy theories with racial tropes, or Islamophobia, where fears are rooted in a complex mix of theological concerns, cultural stereotypes, and nationalist politics.
And when you look at that kind of blended prejudice, an effective interfaith response has to address all of those interwoven dimensions. You can't just treat them as isolated categories.
You can't. And the work requires historical clarity, which brings us to our third section, the non-negotiable reckoning. Confronting this history is mandatory, even when it involves acknowledging deep failures within your own tradition.
And we do have to acknowledge the complexity here, right? The complicity versus resistance. The reviewer, Barshiski, noted that while Nilsson emphasizes the Christian roots of Hitler's personal ideology, the Nazi regime also systematically persecuted churches and clergy who resisted them.
And that is the essential nuance we have to hold. Nazi ideology successfully appropriated the raw material of pre-existing Christian anti-Semitism, the centuries of anti-Jewish teachings, and they persecuted those Christian institutions and individuals who opposed their political authority. Both are true.
So the takeaway for Christian communities specifically is that they have to grapple with how their tradition's long history of anti-Jewish teaching provided the theological groundwork for Nazism.
Yes, even as heroic individuals within that same tradition offered resistance. The theological tradition itself requires scrutiny.
And this responsibility is universal.
It's universal. Every religious community has to wrestle with this. Muslim communities have to address how their classical texts are weaponized by extremist groups, even though the vast majority of Muslims reject that violence. The responsibility is to examine the potential for abuse within the tradition itself.
Let's put this into a historical context. Post-Holocaust, there were massive theological changes, particularly in Christian communities. We often cite the Catholic Church's 1965 declaration, Nostra Aetate. For anyone who may not be familiar, what was the seismic shift there?
Nostra Aetate was just monumental. It officially repudiated the ancient doctrine of supersessionism, the idea that the church had superseded or replaced Israel as God's chosen people. It acknowledged the spiritual bond between Christians and Jews and definitively rejected the idea that Jews bore collective guilt for the death of Jesus.
That was huge progress, but what Nilsson's research suggests is that this work can't just stop there.
Precisely. Because Nilsson characterizes the Aryan Jesus as a horrifying mutation. It wasn't some random event. It emerged from the broader currents of Western religious thought, which had long created space for anti-Jewish sentiment. If that mutation can emerge from the tradition needs to be robustly protected against any future distortions.
Which leads directly to the question of practical response. If the stakes are this high, if this perverse theology built the groundwork for genocide, what are the imperatives we have to pursue today?
The first imperative has to be theological clarity and integrity. For Christian communities, this means continuing to explicitly and unapologetically reject any interpretation of Jesus or Christian teaching that delegitimizes Judaism or the Jewish people. And this isn't about political correctness. It's about theological coherence.
It's about being true to your own roots.
Right. A faith that emerges from Judaism cannot be true to itself while perpetuating contempt for its origins.
And that rejection has to be ingrained in the next generation. So the second imperative is honest education.
Yes. The full, sometimes gruesome history of Christian anti-Semitism has to be taught honestly in all educational institutions. We need to trace the full historical arc from the hostile rhetoric of some early church fathers through medieval blood libels, right up to how those concepts paved the way for modern racialized theories.
We can't prevent future distortions if we don't understand the past ones.
Exactly. And the third imperative is maybe the most difficult, because it requires us to radically adjust how we view extreme movements. It's the necessity of intellectual humility.
What do you mean by that?
We have to take seriously the ethical and spiritual self-understanding of movements we find abhorrent. The Nazis genuinely believed they were engaged in a righteous cause. We cannot just dismiss genocidal movements as simply irrational or insane. They operated with a profound internal, perverse moral logic, and understanding that logic is the critical key to preventing its recurrence.
And we can connect this immediately to the contemporary world where historical trauma is still an active agent. The sources note how deeply this shapes modern interfaith encounters.
This is the living context of dialogue. Jewish communities, they rightly bring the memory of centuries of Christian persecution culminating in the Holocaust to the table. Muslim communities bring the experience of being targeted by hate crimes in the post-9/11 era.
So interfaith dialogue is navigating this painful history every single time people sit down together.
Every single time, especially in moments of global polarization like the one we're living through now.
Nilsson's work really leaves us balanced on a knife edge. The need to seek common ground, which is essential for peace, and the non-negotiable need to confront historical failures, which is essential for honesty.
It forces us to ask what genuine inclusion even looks like. And this leads to a concept called covenantal pluralism. This isn't about saying all paths are the same, not at all. It's a recognition that different communities can maintain their deep, distinctive theological commitments while affirming the full humanity and dignity of others.
That sounds lofty. Can you give us a quick, tangible example?
Sure. For a Christian, it means affirming Jesus as the Christ while simultaneously affirming the full validity of God's unbroken covenant with the Jewish people. For a Muslim, it means believing the Quran is the final revelation while respecting the integrity of other traditions as distinct spiritual paths. You stay deeply rooted in your own tradition while remaining completely open and affirming of the other.
And this pluralism, built on mutual respect, can't be constructed on historical amnesia.
Never. It requires painful, humbling memory of how traditions have failed, creating those horrifying mutations like the Aryan Jesus.
But there is a positive conclusion here as well, isn't there?
There is. The sources noted that religious traditions contain the resources for self-critique and transformation. The monumental post-Holocaust renewal in Christianity proves that profound change is possible. The same scriptures that were twisted to justify genocide also contain explicit, unwavering calls for justice, for love, for radical compassion.
So the ultimate test, then, is not whether the resources for hate exist, but which interpretations a community chooses to privilege, to reinforce, and to teach.
That's the entire game.
This deep dive has shown us the dark consequence of fusing political power with a distorted spiritual mandate. It's what we want to leave you with today. While the historical resources for self-critique and transformation exist within all major traditions, the question is how we safeguard them. How do we structure our communities and our education today to ensure the resources for justice and love permanently outweigh the potential for distortion and hatred? We've given you a lot to process. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.